The ambulance doors closed just as my wife's taxi pulled away for the airport. I was being rushed to the hospital with crushing pain in my chest, but she never looked back. She smiled, waved, and said, "This vacation has been planned for months. You will be fine." She had no idea those would become the most expensive words she would ever speak. My name is John Carter. I am 71 years old, and after 42 years of marriage, I believed my wife would stand beside me during the worst moment of my life. I was wrong. That morning started like any other. I was making breakfast when a sharp pain spread across my chest and down my left arm. I could barely breathe. I called out for my wife, Emily. She came downstairs carrying her suitcase instead of helping me. I told her I thought I was having a heart attack. She looked at her watch, sighed, and said the taxi would arrive in 5 minutes. She told me to call an ambulance because she could not miss the vacation she had spent months planning with her friends. I stared at her, hoping she would change her mind. Instead, she picked up her suitcase, kissed me on the forehead, and walked toward the front door. Before leaving, she said, "We both know you worry too much. The doctors will probably send you home in a few hours." A minute later, I collapsed onto the kitchen floor. My neighbor heard the noise, rushed inside, and called for an ambulance. As the paramedics lifted me onto the stretcher, I watched my wife's taxi disappear down the street. Lying there, struggling to breathe, I made one quiet promise to myself. If I survived this day, nothing in my life would ever be the same again. The ambulance siren echoed through the streets, but all I could think about was my wife driving toward the airport instead of the hospital. Every breath felt heavier than the last. One of the paramedics looked at the heart monitor, then at me, and quietly told his partner, "We need to move. Faster." Those words alone told me this was far more serious than I wanted to believe. When we arrived at the emergency room, doctors and nurses rushed me inside without asking many questions. They placed oxygen over my face and connected me to several machines. A doctor leaned over and said, "Mr. Carter, we believe you are having a major heart attack. We need to begin treatment immediately." I closed my eyes and nodded. I reached for my phone and called my wife one more time. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. A few minutes later, I received a short text message. "I just boarded the plane. Please do not ruin this trip, unless it is really serious." I stared at those words until the screen became blurry. After 42 years of marriage, that was all I meant to her. The doctor asked if there was another family member they could contact. I gave him my daughter's number. She answered on the first ring. Before I could finish explaining, she said, "Dad, I am leaving right now. I will be there as fast as I can." As the nurses wheeled me toward the operating room, I looked at my phone one last time. My wife's message was still on the screen. At that moment, I realized something painful. My heart was not the only thing breaking that day. My marriage was too. When I opened my eyes again, the bright lights above me were gone. I was lying in a quiet hospital room with monitors beeping beside my bed. The doctor walked in with a gentle smile and said, "Mr. Carter, you are very fortunate. Another 30 minutes, and we might not have been able to save you." His words stayed with me long after he left the room. I had come closer to death than I ever realized. A few minutes later, my daughter rushed into the room with tears running down her face. She held my hand tightly and said, "Dad, I was so scared I would not make it in time." I smiled and told her I was still here. She looked around the room before asking the question I already knew was coming. "Where is Mom?" I stayed silent for a few seconds before handing her my phone. She read the text message my wife had sent and slowly lowered the phone. Her eyes filled with disappointment. "She still got on the plane?" she whispered. I nodded. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Later that evening, my phone finally rang. It was my wife. I answered without saying a word. Instead of asking how I was feeling, she sounded annoyed. "Why has everyone been calling me? My vacation has barely started." I closed my eyes and calmly replied, "The doctor said I almost died today." There was a brief silence. Then she said something I never expected. "Well, you survived, did not you? Let us talk when I get back." Before I could answer, she ended the call. I slowly placed the phone on the bedside table and looked out the window. 42 years of marriage had just been reduced to a conversation that lasted less than a minute. At that moment, I stopped waiting for an apology. and I started thinking about what my life would look like without her. The next morning, my doctor told me I would need several weeks of recovery, and that I could not live with constant stress anymore. He looked me in the eyes and said, "Mr. Carter, your heart survived this attack, but another one could be much worse. From today forward, you must put your health before everything else." I thanked him, but deep inside I knew the hardest part of my recovery had nothing to do with medicine. It had everything to do with my marriage. My daughter stayed beside me every day, bringing homemade meals, helping me walk through the hospital hallway, and making sure I never felt alone. My wife, however, never called to ask how I was recovering. Instead, she continued posting smiling vacation photos from beaches, restaurants, and luxury hotels. Friends and relatives began sending me screenshots because they could not believe what they were seeing. Every new picture hurt more than the last. One afternoon, my daughter quietly placed my phone on the bed and said, "Dad, I think you need to see this." My wife had uploaded another photo with the caption, "Finally enjoying the vacation I truly deserved." Thousands of people had liked it. Nobody knew that, at the exact moment that photo was taken, I was learning how to walk without feeling pain in my chest. I locked my phone and placed it in the drawer. Something inside me changed that day. I was no longer angry. I was no longer waiting for an explanation. The disappointment had become something much quieter. Acceptance. That evening, a nurse walked into my room carrying a large envelope. "Mr. Carter," she said, "someone dropped this off for you this afternoon." There was no name on the envelope, only 6 handwritten words across the front. "It is time to protect yourself, John." I stared at the envelope for several seconds before opening it. Inside was a business card from my family lawyer and a handwritten note. It read, "John, after everything that has happened, you should review your estate plan immediately. Do not wait." I recognized the handwriting at once. It belonged to my older brother, who had passed away years earlier. Before he died, he had asked the lawyer to deliver the note only if I ever faced a moment that proved the people around me no longer valued me. I slowly folded the paper and slipped it back into the envelope. Maybe my brother had seen something in my marriage long before I did. The next afternoon, I was discharged from the hospital. My daughter drove me straight to the lawyer's office instead of taking me home. He welcomed us warmly, then placed several folders on his desk. "John," he said, "your current will leave almost everything to your wife. If that is still your wish, we will keep it exactly as it is. But after what I have been told, I believe you should read every page carefully before making any decision." I spent nearly an hour reviewing documents I had not looked at in years. For the first time, I asked myself a painful question. If I had died 3 days ago, who would truly have been grieving? And who would simply have inherited everything? The answer was difficult to accept. I picked up the pen, looked at my daughter, then quietly signed the new documents. The lawyer nodded without saying a word. As he placed them into a secure file, he looked at me and said, "These changes will surprise someone when the time comes." I took a deep breath and replied, "That is exactly why they need to be made." What I did not know was that my wife was already on her way home, completely unaware that her future had changed while she was lying on a beach, thousands of miles away. 3 days later, my wife returned home with expensive shopping bags, a deep tan, and hundreds of vacation photos on her phone. She walked through the front door smiling as if nothing had happened. The first words out of her mouth were not, "How are you feeling?" Instead, she laughed and said, "You would have loved the beach. It was beautiful." I looked at her quietly, waiting for some sign of regret. None came. She sat down at the kitchen table and began telling me about luxury dinners, boat tours, and 5-star hotels. It was as though my heart attack had been nothing more than a small inconvenience. Finally, she looked at me and asked, "So, what did the doctors say?" I answered honestly, "They said I came within 30 minutes of dying." She froze for a moment, then simply replied, "Well, at least everything turned out fine." Those words hurt more than the heart attack itself. Later that evening, she noticed the stack of legal papers on my desk. "What are these?" she asked. I calmly folded them and placed them back into the drawer. "Just some documents I needed to update while I was recovering." She smiled and shrugged, showing no interest in asking another question. That was the moment I realized she still believed nothing had changed between us. She had no idea that while she was enjoying sunsets on a tropical beach, I had spent hours deciding what the rest of my life would look like. Before going to bed, I quietly locked the drawer containing the new will. I slipped the key into my pocket and looked at our wedding photograph hanging on the wall. For the first time in 42 years, I did not see a future together. I saw a chapter of my life that was finally coming to an end. My wife acted as though everything had returned to normal, but I could not forget the day she walked away while I was fighting for my life. Every meal we shared felt quiet. Every conversation felt empty. It was no longer the same marriage. One afternoon, my daughter came to visit. After my wife left the room to answer a phone call, she looked at me and asked, "Dad, have you decided what you are going to do?" I took a deep breath and nodded. Yes, I spent 42 years putting everyone else first. It is time I started respecting myself. My daughter gently placed her hand on mine. "Whatever you decide, I will support you." Those words gave me more strength than she could ever imagine. The following morning, I returned to my lawyer's office. He placed the updated will in front of me one final time and asked, "Are you absolutely certain?" This time I did not hesitate. I signed every page without stopping. My house, my savings, my investments, and everything I had spent a lifetime building would no longer go to the person who left me alone when I needed her most. As I stood to leave, the lawyer handed me another envelope. "Keep this somewhere safe," he said. "You may need it sooner than you think." I thanked him and drove home. When I walked through the front door, my wife was sitting on the couch planning another vacation with her friends. She smiled without looking up and said, "You should come with us next time." I quietly slipped the envelope into my desk drawer and looked at her for a moment. She still believed nothing had changed. She had no idea that with the stroke of a pen that morning, she had already lost everything she thought would always be hers. The morning after I signed the new will, I felt a strange sense of peace. It was not because my marriage had been repaired. It was because I had finally accepted the truth. My wife and I were living in the same house, but we were no longer living the same life. She spent hours planning another vacation with her friends, while I spent my days recovering from a heart attack that had nearly ended my life. Not once did she ask if I was sleeping well or if my chest still hurt. One afternoon, she walked into the living room holding a travel brochure and smiled. "There is a cruise next spring," she said. "We should book it before the prices go up." I looked at her in disbelief. She was talking about another vacation while I was still taking medication every morning just to keep my heart stable. I calmly replied, "I am not planning another trip." She rolled her eyes and laughed. "You cannot spend the rest of your life thinking about one little heart attack." Those words hit harder than anything she had said before. To her, the worst day of my life had become nothing more than a minor inconvenience. I stood up, walked to my study, and unlocked the drawer where I had hidden the legal papers. I looked at them for a long moment before closing the drawer again. My decision had already been made. I was simply waiting for the right time. That evening, my daughter called to check on me. Before ending the conversation, she quietly said, "Dad, I heard Mom telling her friends that everything will be hers one day anyway." Remained silent for several seconds. Then I thanked my daughter and ended the call. As I looked toward the living room, where my wife was laughing at something on television, I realized she was still living under one dangerous assumption, that she would inherit everything I had spent my entire life building. She had no idea how wrong she was. My daughter's words stayed in my mind all night. My wife believed that no matter what happened between us, she would eventually inherit everything I owned. She had no idea that those plans disappeared the day she chose a vacation over sitting beside my hospital bed. The following afternoon, I overheard her talking on the phone with one of her friends. She laughed and said, "John always forgives me. He gets upset for a few days, then everything goes back to normal. Besides, one day this house and everything in it will belong to me anyway." I stood quietly in the hallway, listening without making a sound. For the first time in 42 years, I realized she had stopped seeing me as her husband. I had become part of her future plans instead. That evening, she noticed I had become unusually quiet. She asked, "Is something bothering you?" I looked at her calmly and replied, "I have been thinking about how quickly life can change." She smiled and said, "Do not worry so much. We still have plenty of years ahead of us." I nodded, but I already knew my future would not include the marriage we once had. 2 days later, my lawyer called and told me every legal document had been finalized. My will, property records, and financial accounts had all been updated exactly as I requested. There was only one step left. He asked if I wanted the divorce papers prepared as well. I looked out the window for several seconds before quietly answering, "Yes, it is time." He told me everything would be ready within the week. As I ended the call, I walked into the living room. My wife looked up from her phone and smiled as if nothing had changed. She had no idea that the envelope, arriving at our front door in just a few days, would end the life she believed was guaranteed forever. 4 days later, the doorbell rang just after breakfast. My wife walked to the front door with a smile, expecting another package from one of her online shopping orders. Instead, a courier handed her a large sealed envelope and asked her to sign for it. She thanked him, closed the door, and casually opened the envelope while standing in the hallway. A few seconds later, the color disappeared from her face. She looked at the first page, then quickly turned to the second. Her hands began to shake. "John, what is this?" she whispered. I calmly looked up from my chair and answered, "Read the last page." Flipped through the papers until she reached my signature. Her eyes filled with disbelief. "Divorce?" she asked. "You cannot be serious." I slowly stood and faced her. "I have never been more serious in my life." She stared at me as though she had never seen me before. "You are ending 42 years of marriage because I went on one vacation?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, I am ending it because when I thought I was dying, you chose that vacation instead of standing beside me." She tried to interrupt, but I quietly continued. "A marriage is not tested on the easy days. It is tested on the worst day of someone's life. That was my worst day, and you were not there." Tears began forming in her eyes for the first time. She stepped closer and said, "John, we can fix this." I looked at her with sadness rather than anger. "I spent weeks hoping you would say those words on your own. They only came after you opened that envelope." She stood frozen, holding the papers tightly in her hands. Then she asked the one question she had been afraid to ask. "Does this mean I lose everything?" I looked into her eyes and quietly answered, "You lost everything the day you walked out that front door while I was being carried into an ambulance." My wife stood in complete silence, still holding the divorce papers. For the first time in years, she had no excuses, no explanations, and no one else to blame. Tears slowly rolled down her face as she whispered, "John, I made a terrible mistake." I looked at her quietly. I had imagined hearing those words many times while I was lying in the hospital, but now they felt strangely empty. They had arrived too late. She walked toward me and reached for my hand, but I gently stepped back. "Please," she said, "do not throw away 42 years because of one bad decision." I took a deep breath and answered, "It was not one decision. It was the moment I realized where I stood in your list of priorities." She began crying harder. "I thought you would recover. I never believed your life was truly in danger." I nodded. "Exactly. You assumed. You never stayed long enough to find out." The room fell silent again. A few minutes later, my daughter arrived. She had come because I asked her to be there when the papers were delivered. She looked at her mother, then at me, and immediately understood what had happened. My wife turned to her and pleaded, "Tell your father not to do this." My daughter lowered her eyes before quietly replying, "Mom, when Dad was in the hospital, I stayed beside him every single day. You chose a beach instead. I cannot defend that." Those words hit harder than anything I had said. My wife sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the weight of what she had lost. Before leaving the room, I placed one final envelope on the table. She looked at it with trembling hands. "What is this?" she asked. I calmly replied, "Those are the papers that show where everything I own will go after I am gone." Her hands froze before she even opened the envelope. My wife stared at the envelope for several seconds before slowly opening it. Her hands were trembling so badly that she almost dropped the papers onto the floor. She quickly scanned the first page, then the second. The expression on her face changed from hope to complete disbelief. "You changed everything," she whispered. I nodded calmly. "Yes." She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "You really removed me from your will?" I answered. "The day I thought my life was ending, I learned who truly wanted to be there for me. My will now reflects that truth." She sat down without saying another word. For the first time since returning from her vacation, she understood that this was not an argument that would disappear in a few days. It was the consequence of a choice she could never take back. My daughter quietly walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. She had never asked for my money, my house, or my savings. She had only asked me to recover and stay alive. That difference meant everything to me. My wife looked toward our daughter and softly said, "I never wanted it to end like this," my daughter replied. "Neither did Dad. But when he needed you most, you left." The room became silent again. There was nothing left to argue about because the truth was sitting between all of us. A few moments later, my wife wiped away her tears and asked one final question. "Is there anything I can do to fix this?" I looked at her for a long time before quietly answering. "Some mistakes can be forgiven, but some moments only happen once." The day I was taken away in that ambulance was one of those moments. She lowered her head, knowing there was no answer to those words. As I walked toward my study, my phone rang. It was my lawyer. After a short conversation, I slowly smiled for the first time in weeks. Everything was now legally complete. From that moment forward, nothing could be changed. My wife had finally understood the cost of her decision, but she understood it far too late. The days that followed were surprisingly quiet. There were no more arguments, no more excuses, and no more attempts to pretend everything was normal. My wife moved into the guest room while the legal process continued. We lived under the same roof, but our lives had already gone in different directions. One evening, I found her sitting alone in the backyard, staring at an old photo album. She looked up at me with red eyes and quietly said, "I forgot how happy we used to be." I looked at the photographs for a moment. There were pictures from our first home, family holidays, birthdays, and the day our daughter was born. They reminded me that our marriage had once been built on love. That was what made everything so painful. I replied, "Those memories are real, but they cannot erase the choices we made later." She nodded without arguing. For the first time, she accepted responsibility instead of making excuses. A week later, the court finalized the divorce. We walked out of the courthouse through separate doors. There were no angry words, no shouting, and no celebration. Only silence. As I stood beside my car, my wife slowly walked toward me. She said, "If I could go back to that morning, I would cancel the trip without thinking twice." I believe she meant every word. But time gives no second chances. I wished her well and quietly drove away. That evening, I returned to my house, now peaceful for the first time in years. My daughter came over with dinner, and we sat together talking about the future instead of the past. Before she left, she smiled and said, "Dad, I finally see you." Breathing without carrying the weight of disappointment, I smiled back, because she was right. I had not only survived a heart attack, I had survived the hardest decision of my life. And for the first time in a long while, I felt free. Almost a year passed after the divorce, and life became quieter than I ever imagined. Every morning, I walked through the neighborhood, visited my wife's grave. No, I caught myself. That habit of speaking as though the past still existed had finally begun to fade. Instead, I visited the park where my late father used to take me as a child. I spent more time with my daughter and grandchildren, and for the first time in years, my home felt peaceful instead of tense. My heart grew stronger with every passing month, and so did my peace of mind. One afternoon, I received a letter from my ex-wife. She wrote that she regretted leaving for that vacation every single day. She admitted that no beach, no hotel, and no trip had ever been worth losing the person who had stood beside her for more than 4 decades. She asked for nothing. She did not ask to come back, and she did not mention money. She simply wanted me to know she finally understood what she had thrown away. I folded the letter, placed it inside a drawer, and quietly thanked God for helping me let go of my anger. I no longer wished her any harm. I simply accepted that our story had reached its end. That evening, my daughter asked me if I had replied to the letter. I smiled and shook my head. "Some conversations belong in the past," I said. She hugged me and replied, "I am proud of the man you chose to become after everything you went through." As I looked around my home, I realized something important. I had spent months believing my heart attack had ruined my life. In reality, it had revealed the truth I had been unable to see for years. It almost took my life, but it also gave me a second chance to live it the right way. And that was a gift worth far more than anything money could ever buy. 2 years have passed since the day my life changed forever. When I look back now, I do not remember the pain of the heart attack as much as I remember the lesson it taught me. For most of my life, I believed loving someone meant always putting them first, even when they stopped doing the same for you. I thought a long marriage meant nothing could ever break the bond between two people. But I learned that love requires effort from both sides. One person cannot carry an entire relationship alone. My ex-wife and I eventually reached a place where there was no anger between us. We were not the same couple we once were, but we were two people who accepted the choices we had made. She built a new life, and I built mine. I never regretted protecting myself because that decision gave me the chance to finally understand my own worth. My daughter often tells me that the man who came out of the hospital was different from the man who entered it. She says I became calmer, stronger, and happier. Maybe she is right. Before my heart attack, I was afraid of losing my marriage. After it, I realized I had already lost something more important, myself. Today, I spend my mornings enjoying simple things I once ignored. A quiet cup of coffee, a walk outside, time with my family. These moments are priceless because I know how quickly life can change. If there is one thing my story taught me, it is this. Never wait until a crisis to discover who truly stands beside you. And never forget that your own life, your own happiness, and your own peace matter too. My wife chose a vacation over my heart attack. At the time, I thought she had taken everything from me, but I was wrong. That day, I did not lose my life. I found it again.